job. These are not statistics. These are your neighbors, your friends, your family members. It could at some point be any of us. That's why we set up a system of unemployment insurance. The notion was everybody is making a contribution because you don't know when the business cycle or an economic crisis might make any of us vulnerable. We make this promise to our fellow Americans who are working hard to get back on their feet, because when times get tough, we are not a people who say you're on your own. We're people who believe that we're all in it together. And we know, there but the grace of God go I. So that's the values case for this. That's the moral case for this.
Well, there you have it, Jerry. There's the moral case for it.
The values case.
Yes, the values case.
Politician.
Yeah. So, go ahead, please.
Yeah, we've got the wrong values. Unemployment is designed for temporary disruptions in people's lives. Unemployment compensation. I'm not against that. It's kind of a social safety net, but not a social safety net like welfare. It's designed to be much more temporary. It's designed for people between jobs. It's not designed as a long-term long-term welfare program. And what's happening is it's being transformed into a long-term welfare program. And it's bad as a long-term welfare program because the incentives are all wrong. You're paid not to work. This is a welfare program that you lose the moment you work. So the incentive is away from labor. From a Christian standpoint, that's a real problem because it's human to labor. It's the very first command that we're given, to fill the earth and subdue it. So to be human is to work. Paul says, if man will not work, neither shall he eat. So it's a terrible degradation of human dignity to incentivize people to not enter the workforce. I understand that there are people who've been laid off and they're between jobs. I've been there. Mm-hmm. But if it's 2 years, then it's probably not between jobs. It's probably more of a long-term issue, in which case you ought to be, dealing with some of those long-term issues and get more into a traditional welfare type program. It's really incoherent for the president to argue that this emergency extension of unemployment compensation ought to be continued, and at the same time argue that the economy is doing pretty well. I mean, either the emergency's over, in which case the emergency extension should end, or we're still in an emergency, in which case the president should acknowledge the utter failure of his economic policies and say, not only are we still in a slump or still slow, but we're still in an emergency. Of course, I think that any of the American people who are paying attention are probably thinking, at least I was, when the president said, well, the financial crisis was so bad, and I'm thinking, we're talking about the financial crisis of 2008, right? I mean, have I missed another financial crisis? It's 2014. Precisely how long can we hang all of our problems on the financial crisis of 2008? How long can we blame that for what's going wrong? I don't know. I think we're going to test how long we're going to find out what the limit is. But I think we're approaching the limit point where people are going to say, wait, the president has been in office long enough. He has had all of his landmark pieces of legislation passed. Every one of the big items, FinReg, credit card reg, Obamacare, stimulus, all of them got passed. And I think it's getting to be just indefensible for him to say that this has anything to do with 2008 and President George W. Bush. So go ahead, please.
No. Well, but he locks in and he zones in on something that I think, because everything you've said is dead spot on. And really, there's no, if you're talking to somebody about this, they really don't have a rejoinder to it other than to try to shift to the thought directly of the people that would be losing those checks,
yes.
The checks coming in.
Yes.
And we all relate to that because
Sure.
we all have that 3 o'clock in the morning, hey, wake up, especially, and I don't mean this in a sexist way by any means, but I mean this in the sense of, hey, I got to keep a roof over the heads of my wife, me, the kids, and make sure. And what if I don't have that? What do I don't have a job? What if I don't have something coming in? It's terrifying. Now, I'll tell you, since coming to Christ, truly coming to Christ, and you've known me through the years, but I will say that it has gotten a lot easier because I go directly to the Lord with it.
Yes.
But that fear is very effective, very effective. And we could talk about economic policy and a whole host of things. But you've said something before on this broadcast that I've quoted numerous times, countless times since you've said it, which is statism is not about the state versus the individual. It's about the state versus God.
That's right.
And so in that, with that idea and that lens and that thought, how is it that we take on the argument of compassion from, or the idea that people are in need and somebody is saying, you don't want to help them, you don't care about them? We have to address the emotional, do we not?
Oh, absolutely.
But we can do it biblically. How do we do it?
I would argue that the welfare state doesn't want to help them, and the welfare state doesn't care about them, except as voters. But that Christians and God cares about them, and we understand that long-term dependency is a kind of hell on earth, and it's destructive of wealth. I mean, if someone's listening to me right now, I think Charles Murray asked this once. When you think about your kids, if you let's say you were out of the picture, right, and you could choose, two paths for your kids. They could go with a family where the dad works, maybe the mom and dad work. Let's just say the father works. He doesn't make much money, and they're lower middle class. They're scraping by, or you would put him in a family, you put your children in a family where neither of the parents work, they are receiving government benefits, and they have a higher income through government benefits than the first family. In other words, you can put your kids with a family that's scraping by on $25,000 a year working, or you can put your kids with a family that maybe is gaming the system, they've got $35,000 a year not working. Which family would you want to raise your kids if you were deceased?
Obviously, the one that is earning it as opposed to receiving it.
Yes, any sane person would choose that.
Mm-hmm.
So why do we choose the opposite for tens of millions of other children and call it compassion? And how dare we? And how does anyone who calls that compassion live with themselves? It's destructive. It's funny, as we're having this conversation, I'm thinking about a friend of mine. I'm not going to mention his name. I won't mention enough. But I have a friend who, had some job problems. He was laid off. It was a little before the time of the financial crisis. He had a little trouble getting work. He ended up going on unemployment. And then when we'd meet with him, he and his wife were friends of ours, and we'd spend time with them, and he'd always be wondering, would the unemployment compensation get extended, right? He was always looking for the next extension. And it's interesting because this is a Christian guy and a conservative guy. I mean, he hated Obama, but he still wanted to make sure the unemployment compensation, got approved. This went on for over 2 years, and he descended deeper and deeper into a kind of lethargy and depression and hopelessness. And eventually his wife left him, and his kids despised him. The wife and kids left him, or I guess he left, moved in with his parents. This is a middle-aged guy. Maybe he's still getting unemployment compensation, but I just think of him as the picture of long-term unemployment. And by the way, he's a reasonably skilled guy. He's a master's degree. So he could work, but he got himself stuck in a culture of dependency. And it took away his family, it took away his dignity, took away his independence. That happens to people all the time. This is no answer to the problem. This is the symptom of the problem. See, the president, and not just the president, to some degree even the previous president, George W. Bush,
yes,
the big spending and the Medicare Part D that the White House asked me to defend that I refused to, which is just like a little mini Obamacare. We have created a European-style economic stagnation. Well, when you have a European-style economic stagnation, you have to create a European-style welfare state to accommodate the cast-offs, the victims of that stagnation. Or you have to go back, reverse the European-style stagnation, and get back to an American-style growth. So it's almost like, Hayek argues this in The Road to Serfdom. You do one thing wrong, and then there's a choice. Do I go back? Do I repent? Or do I do another thing wrong to cover the mistakes that come from the first thing wrong? So we've done all this government policy, the tax hikes, the excess spending, the excess regulation, and we've got an economy that's growing at far less than average for recovery. So then what do? Do we reverse all those bad policies and get back to American-style growth rates? No. We take another step towards Europe with a kind of permanent dependency in the form of yet another emergency extension of unemployment compensation. That's the wrong direction. The value, the wickedness, the evil is not that we fail to extend the welfare state to put people on welfare for 2 or 3 years. The evil is the economic growth is so bad that seems like a plausible answer. The problem is not long-term unemployment compensation. The problem is long-term unemployment, and that lands at the door of Washington, D.C., particularly 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And it's about time he starts to take responsibility for turning the greatest growth machine in the history of the world into just yet another stagnant Euro economy.
Jerry Bowyer, pleasure, privilege, great blessing. Thank you.
God bless
Great
you.
to be with you.
Bye-bye.
Love you. Praying Durham's nothing but truth. Pastor Aaron Free, next. AFR Talk.